Kentucky's legendary whiskey business may be in crisis mode. Major distilleries are shutting down and thousands of jobs are at risk as the industry struggles against declining sales and damaging trade disputes. 3 prominent Kentucky distilleries have collapsed into bankruptcy over the past 8 months.
But really, this was such a fascinating insight into perhaps the first American industry, or at least one of the first, to get hit so hard so early by this trade war that they can now show us kind of quantifiable, tangible impacts. And suffice it to say, for American whiskey producers, this new reality is sobering.
America never thought this day would come. For decades, U.S. distilleries believed they controlled the global whiskey market, confident, dominant, and unchallenged. But while Washington was busy focusing on Europe and Asia, Africa was quietly building something powerful. Across the continent, new whiskey brands, new factories, and new trade alliances were rising faster, cheaper, and more competitive than anything the U.S. expected. Africa stopped relying on American imports. African governments began pushing local spirits first. And within just a few years, U.S. whiskey shipments to Africa collapsed. Today, American distilleries, once proud symbols of U.S. craftsmanship, are shutting down production lines, laying off workers, and drowning in debt. And the shocking part: almost nobody in America saw this coming. This isn't just a story about whiskey. It's a story about how the United States underestimated one of the fastest-growing markets in the world and is now paying the price. Stay with me, because what Africa did next shook the entire American drink industry to its core. The story begins with an industry once considered untouchable. American whiskey, especially bourbon, has been a symbol of national pride for decades, representing craftsmanship, culture, and billions of dollars in export revenue. From the rolling hills of Kentucky to the warehouses of Tennessee, distilleries thrived, exporting their spirits across the globe, their labels synonymous with quality and tradition. The United States had long assumed its dominance in the global spirits market was unshakable. Few imagined a time when American whiskey could face a real threat. But that assumption, as history shows, was a dangerous one. Across the Atlantic, the African continent quietly began reshaping the economic map of trade. African nations, once heavy importers of American whiskey, started taking a different path. The catalyst was not just a desire to build local industries, it was also a response to policies originating thousands of miles away, policies that were slowly strangling trade. U.S. tariffs on imported African goods, combined with an unpredictable trade environment, had angered African governments and businesses. They had grown tired of being constrained, taxed, and told how to trade. And slowly but surely they began to push back. The first signs were subtle. Orders from African importers declined. Containers of American whiskey sat in ports, waiting for buyers that never came. Shipping companies began reporting unusual patterns with African distributors increasingly sourcing from local producers or turning to European and Asian alternatives. By the time the U.S. government noticed, the trend had snowballed into a full-scale economic shock. What many Americans failed to see was that Africa wasn't just saying no to whiskey. They were saying no to being dictated to. Tariffs intended to protect American industries inadvertently pushed African countries to invest in self-sufficiency. Local distilleries sprang up in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, producing spirits that matched international quality standards but came at competitive prices. In markets that once belonged almost entirely to U.S. exports, American whiskey was suddenly overpriced, outmaneuvered, and rejected. The financial toll was immediate. Distilleries that had counted on African demand began facing declining revenues. Kentucky, a state synonymous with bourbon, witnessed an unprecedented crisis. Families that had run distilleries for generations found themselves laying off workers. Storage warehouses once filled to the brim were suddenly overstocked with bottles that could not leave the state. Across the country, small and medium distilleries teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. Even the largest producers were forced to cut back on production, reassess markets, and confront the painful truth. Africa had rewritten the rules of engagement. The human cost was palpable. Workers who had dedicated their lives to the distilling craft faced unemployment. Farmers who grew the corn, wheat, and rye that fueled these industries saw demand plummet, with prices dropping and contracts canceled. Families that had relied on bourbon as the backbone of their local economies suddenly faced uncertainty. Local communities built around distillery towns felt the shock ripple through schools, shops, and local businesses. The whiskey crisis became more than numbers. It became a human tragedy, a ripple effect across the heart of America. From a political perspective, the situation was a nightmare. Washington had long ignored Africa as a major economic player. Trade negotiations were minimal, and policies were designed with Europe, China, and Latin America in mind. The result? African nations moved with precision, leveraging the U.S. tariffs as justification to cultivate local industries, strengthen regional trade alliances, and prioritize African-made products over imports. What Washington saw as minor trade resistance was, in reality, a sophisticated economic strategy that left U.S. distilleries exposed. Meanwhile, in Africa, the story was one of pride, innovation, and opportunity. Governments celebrated local entrepreneurship. Investors poured funds into distilleries that were modern, efficient, and culturally resonant. Local whiskey brands quickly gained traction not only within the continent but also in Europe and Asia, creating a new class of African global players in the beverage industry. African consumers, eager to support local industries and respond to U.S. trade arrogance, embraced these products wholeheartedly. What had started as a protective, reactive measure became a celebration of African economic independence. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. American tariffs intended to protect domestic industries and punish foreign producers had instead catalyzed the very competition that threatened U.S. distilleries. The more restrictive the policies became, the more African nations doubled down on their self-reliance. Trade barriers that were meant to shield America from foreign competition instead incentivized African countries to produce their own, cutting the U.S. out of an entire market. Industry insiders described it as a perfect storm. Supply chains faltered, shipments stalled, and the once dominant American brands found themselves irrelevant in markets they had taken for granted. Local African distillers who started with modest production lines suddenly found themselves exporting internationally. Marketing campaigns emphasizing quality, culture, and affordability overshadowed decades of American brand dominance. What was supposed to be a minor policy ripple transformed into a tidal wave, and American distilleries were drowning. The emotional fallout extended beyond economics. The United States, long accustomed to being a global leader, suddenly found its pride wounded. Bourbon, a symbol of national identity, was no longer untouchable. Families that had poured generations of tradition into distilleries now faced humiliation in global trade circles. Analysts on both sides of the Atlantic were stunned. How could such a revered, iconic industry be undone by a continent that many Americans had underestimated? For U.S. policymakers, the crisis highlighted decades of strategic oversight. Africa's economic rise had been dismissed or underestimated. Trade negotiations had been slow and reactive, and now the consequences were undeniable. African nations, leveraging tariffs and a commitment to local development, had fundamentally altered the dynamics of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yet, amid the crisis, lessons emerged. Companies began exploring alternative strategies, forming partnerships with African distilleries, investing in local production, or diversifying into new global markets. Governments started rethinking trade approaches, considering how tariffs might have unintended consequences and reevaluating diplomatic ties. But for many distilleries, these measures were too little, too late. Bankruptcy proceedings, layoffs, and closures had already begun, leaving a permanent mark on the industry. The story of America. Underestimating Africa is more than a business lesson. It is a cautionary tale about arrogance, oversight, and the underestimated power of emerging markets. It shows that no industry, no matter how iconic, is immune from global forces. And it demonstrates that economic shifts can happen quietly, subtly, and then strike with overwhelming force, reshaping industries and livelihoods overnight. For the viewers, the message is clear. Underestimating a rising power has consequences. African nations leveraged U.S. policies to their advantage, investing in local talent, infrastructure, and trade networks. American distilleries, once symbols of global dominance, now struggle to survive in markets they assumed were guaranteed. The ripple effects are felt across communities, economies, and families, transforming a policy dispute into a full-blown economic human drama. As the camera pans over empty American distillery floors, abandoned warehouses, and laid-off workers, the contrast becomes striking. Across the ocean, African distilleries hum with life, bottles lined on shelves, export containers shipping worldwide, and local brands gaining recognition in markets that once belonged to the United States. This is not just competition, it is a story of strategic miscalculation, resilience, and the shifting balance of global economic power. The United States, for all its history and economic might, learned a harsh lesson. When a continent decides to reject your products, innovate locally, and build self-reliance, even the most iconic industries can falter. Whiskey is no longer just a drink. It is a symbol of misjudged power, the price of arrogance, and the unstoppable rise of Africa on the global economic stage. And so, as Africa continues to grow and diversify, American distilleries are left grappling with the fallout. Bankruptcy filings, production halts, and layoffs dominate headlines. Families, workers, and communities mourn the loss of an industry they thought invincible. The U.S., meanwhile, watches in disbelief as Africa's newfound economic power quietly reshapes global trade. The story is far from over. African distilleries are only gaining strength. American companies, if they adapt quickly, may reclaim parts of the market. But one truth remains undeniable. The era of guaranteed dominance is over. America underestimated Africa, and the consequences will echo for generations. The story of America underestimating Africa is not just about economics, it is about pride, identity, and the consequences of overlooking a rising power. For generations, U.S. distilleries were symbols of American craftsmanship and tradition. Bourbon, whiskey, and other spirits were more than drinks. They represented culture, family legacy, and national pride. Factories and warehouses across the country were the beating hearts of communities, providing jobs and livelihoods to thousands of families. And yet, in the blink of an eye, all of that was threatened not by a distant superpower, but by a continent that America had long dismissed. As African nations embraced local production and rejected U.S. tariffs, the effects rippled across America like a silent storm. Distilleries that once poured millions of bottles into export markets now faced shelves full of unsold whiskey. Workers who had spent decades perfecting the craft found themselves walking out of factories with empty hands. Families that depended on steady wages suddenly faced uncertainty. Small towns whose economies revolved around distilleries watched as the heartbeat of their communities slowed. It was not just money that was lost, it was a way of life, a piece of America itself. The human toll is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect. Imagine a family that has run a distillery for 3 generations. Fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, all devoted to the craft, all believing in the invincibility of American products. Suddenly forced to face layoffs, closures, and bankruptcy. Local farmers who supplied the corn, rye, and wheat now find themselves scrambling for alternative buyers, watching as years of hard labor are devalued. Communities that thrived on this industry experience a ripple effect. Shops close, schools feel the pinch, and hope dims in towns that once proudly boasted their connection to one of America's greatest exports. Meanwhile, Africa's rise paints a stark contrast. Across the continent, local distilleries hum with activity. Shelves are stocked with homegrown spirits, and entrepreneurs celebrate the fruits of their labor. African consumers embrace these products, proud to support industries that reflect their own culture and talent. What started as a response to unfair trade policies has become a symbol of economic independence, resilience, and ingenuity. African nations are no longer passive participants in global trade, they are active players, shaping markets, challenging assumptions, and taking control of their own destinies. For the United States, this is a painful lesson. It is a reminder that arrogance, underestimation, and short-sighted policies have real consequences. It is a warning that no industry, no matter how iconic or established, is immune to global shifts. The whiskey crisis is more than a trade dispute, it is a human story, a story of loss, resilience, and the price of ignoring change. It is a mirror reflecting the consequences of underestimating others and overestimating one's own invulnerability. And yet, even in the midst of crisis, there is a path forward. The U.S. can learn, adapt, and find new ways to engage with Africa, to rebuild trust, and to re-establish its presence in global markets. Companies can innovate, diversify, and seek partnerships that respect African growth while benefiting both sides. But the clock is ticking and the lessons are stark. The world does not wait for those who rest on past glory. As we reflect on this story, it is impossible not to feel the weight of its lessons. America underestimated. Africa and the consequences are both economic and deeply human. Distilleries face bankruptcy, workers face uncertainty, and entire communities are shaken. Meanwhile, Africa celebrates its newfound strength, its industries thriving, and its people taking control of their own destinies. This is a turning point, a moment that will be studied for years to come, a lesson for policymakers, business, leaders, and every individual watching how global power can shift when one side refuses to be underestimated. The whiskey is more than a drink. It is a symbol. It is a symbol of pride lost, lessons learned, and the unstoppable rise of Africa on the global stage. For America, it is a time of reflection, adaptation, and urgency. For Africa, it is a moment of triumph, ingenuity, and assertion of independence. For the world, it is a reminder that economic power can move quietly, steadily, and with a force that no one can ignore. And as this story unfolds, one truth becomes undeniable. Underestimating a rising power, no matter how distant or unexpected, carries consequences that can shake industries, communities, and nations alike. The United States learned that lesson the hard way. Africa proved its resilience and vision. And the world will never look at whiskey or economic power the same way again.